The grand ballroom of Ashbourne House gleamed with a brilliance that seemed almost cruel in its perfection. Candles flickered in gilded sconces, their flames reflecting in polished mirrors that stretched from floor to ornate ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of wax, rosewater, and the faint tang of polished wood. Outside, a cold November rain tapped insistently against the tall windows, a somber drumbeat that mirrored the unease in Lady Eleanor's chest. At 21, she was neither unremarkable nor frail, yet in a room crowded with London's social elite, she felt exposed, a delicate bird trapped among hawks. Her gown, though elegant in its understated navy silk, could not shield her from the relentless whispers that followed her as she crossed the marble floor. A pity such promise wasted, one lady murmured, her fan fluttering like a white-winged judgment. Her father must be desperate indeed. Eleanor's jaw tightened, yet she held her head high, aware that any tremor of fear or embarrassment would be seized upon by these observers. Her father, Lord Fairbourne, stood near the marble staircase, a rigid figure of control, his fingers drumming lightly against the carved banister. His eyes, dark and calculating, met hers briefly, conveying the silent message she had long dreaded. The arrangements were final. The Duke of Ashbourne, though scarcely 25 himself, had already been spoken of in hushed tones as a man marked by fragility and misfortune, a nobleman whose health had long been the subject of society's speculations. Some said he carried the shadow of a lingering fever. Others whispered of heartbreaks that had left his countenance pale and withdrawn. The very mention of his name had caused Lady Eleanor's acquaintances to glance at her with pity or thinly veiled amusement. And yet, she knew her father's mind was set, for the marriage would restore stability to their dwindling fortunes and perhaps, in his eyes, save her from a future of obscurity. As the orchestra struck up a gentle waltz, Eleanor moved with careful precision, the silk of her gown whispering against polished marble. She could feel every eye upon her, noting the way she held herself, measuring her composure against the high standards of etiquette. She glimpsed the Duke for the first time that evening across the room, a tall figure leaning slightly against a velvet drapery, his posture at once rigid and hesitant. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, held a quiet intensity that made her breath catch, and yet his lips remained set in a line that spoke of restraint and solitude. He did not approach her, and she did not expect him to. Society had taught her that such figures of power often communicated in subtle glances rather than open conversation. Yet even from afar, the weight of his presence pressed upon her heart like a tangible thing. A sudden murmur swept through the ballroom, a ripple of amusement and speculation. "I hear the Duke is hardly able to rise from his chamber these days," whispered a lady in an ivory gown, her words dripping with false concern. Eleanor's chest tightened, and she forced herself to continue the dance, letting her feet follow the rhythm while her mind struggled to maintain composure. Each step felt measured, deliberate, a defiance against the cruel curiosity that sought to reduce her to a subject of gossip. Her cheeks warmed, though not from exertion, and she found herself stealing a glance toward the Duke once more. He remained still, observing in silence the faintest flicker of something, respect, curiosity, perhaps recognition, passing across his features before it vanished behind a mask of detachment. When the music ended, the orchestra fading into a soft murmur, Lord Fairbourne approached, bowing stiffly to the Duke before gesturing to his daughter. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the subtle finality of a verdict, "the arrangement has been confirmed. The Duke expects your formal acceptance this evening." Eleanor's stomach clenched, a mixture of fear and indignation rising within her. Yet she bowed her head, inclining it with the grace demanded by her station. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured and polite, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I shall honor my father's wishes," she said quietly, her eyes meeting the Duke's for the briefest moment. There was a flicker of something in his gaze then, acknowledgment perhaps of the sacrifice she had made and the courage it demanded. As the evening progressed, the ballroom's warmth seemed to contrast cruelly with the chill that had settled deep in Eleanor's bones. Servants glided past with trays of delicate pastries, the soft clink of fine china punctuating the conversations that swirled around her. She noted the subtle hierarchy of the gathering, the way alliances and affections were measured by the tilt of a head, the curl of a smile. In this world, every gesture mattered, and she had learned long ago to read the language of whispers and glances. Yet despite the calculated poise she displayed, Eleanor felt the quiet ache of isolation, the loneliness of a young woman thrust into the orbit of a man whose life had already been marked by fragility and sorrow. The Duke's presence was a silent anchor, ever near, yet never intrusive. Occasionally, their eyes met across the room, and in those moments, Eleanor felt a fleeting connection that defied the rigid constraints of propriety. She wondered, not for the first time, what lay behind the careful mask he wore, what sorrows and secrets had shaped him into the man who now awaited her consent. The thought both terrified and intrigued her, for within the mystery lay the possibility of something unexpected, a bond not dictated solely by duty, but perhaps by understanding, by shared vulnerability. As the evening drew toward its close, the orchestra's final notes lingering in the vaulted chamber, Lord Fairborn inclined his head toward the Duke, signaling that the time had come. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The air seemed to thicken, charged with anticipation and the weight of unspoken expectation. She approached the Duke, her steps steady though her heart trembled. When she reached him, he extended a gloved hand with the faintest bow, the gesture formal yet not devoid of warmth. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low, carrying the subtle resonance of restrained emotion, "I look forward to our union, in whatever form it may come to flourish." Eleanor's breath caught at the words, the carefully chosen phrasing masking something more profound beneath the surface. She inclined her head once more, meeting his eyes with as much courage as she could summon. "As do I, your grace," she replied, her voice steady, though her thoughts raced with uncertainty and a glimmer of hope. In that brief exchange, a seed of connection was planted, fragile yet persistent, a quiet promise that even in a marriage of obligation, there might exist moments of understanding and perhaps, eventually, of affection. And so, as the guests began to depart and the last candles were extinguished, Eleanor stood at the threshold of a new chapter, her heart a mixture of trepidation and tentative anticipation. The Duke retreated into shadowed corridors, and she was left to wonder at the depth of the man she was to call husband. Though the night had been long, the weight of society's scrutiny heavy, and the path ahead uncertain, one truth had begun to take shape. Within the walls of Ashbourne House, amidst the whispers and the candlelight, a story had begun to unfold, one that would challenge.
Conventions test courage, and perhaps, in time, awaken the most unexpected of emotions. The days that followed the grand ballroom were filled with a strange mixture of preparation and anticipation, a delicate tension that settled over Ashbourne House like a thick fog. Lady Eleanor found herself swept into a whirl of fittings and arrangements, each task meticulously overseen by her mother and a cohort of matrons who regarded her with equal parts scrutiny and admiration. Silks were draped and pinned, delicate lace arranged over pale satin, jewels dusted with powdered cloth to catch the light just so. In these moments, Eleanor felt both like a work of art and a subject of examination, her every movement measured, every gesture noted. Yet amidst the bustle, she discovered small threads of solace, the quiet corners of the estate where she might pause, breathe, and reflect upon the inevitable union that loomed closer with each passing day. The Duke of Ashbourne remained an elusive presence, moving through the estate like a shadow at dusk, observed yet rarely approached. Rumors had followed him like persistent echoes, that he walked with a slight falter, that illness had claimed his vigor, that heartbreak had hollowed his smile. But Eleanor, ever watchful and perceptive, noticed subtler truths in the way he lingered near the windows, staring outward with a quiet pensiveness, or in the brief, almost imperceptible straightening of his posture when he passed a portrait of ancestors long departed. There was a gravity to him that commanded attention, though he offered little in words, and she began to understand that the world's assumptions about frailty and weakness were far from the reality of his character. It was during one quiet afternoon in the drawing-room that Eleanor first received a token from the Duke, a gesture that startled her with its intimacy. He entered unannounced, his dark coat brushing softly against the Persian rug, and extended a small, velvet box. "For you, Lady Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low, measured, yet carrying a resonance that set her pulse alight. Within the box lay a delicate locket, its gold filigree etched with intricate vines, enclosing a miniature portrait of a woman whose eyes bore the same shade of grey as the Duke's own. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced the fine details. "It is a family keepsake," he said, a faint shadow crossing his features. "I entrust it to you now, not merely as custom, but as a symbol of what I hope you will understand in time." The weight of his words, carefully chosen, impressed upon her a mixture of curiosity, wonder, and unease. Yet the arrival of the locket could not shield her from the whispers that swirled through London's social circles. A rival cousin, Lady Marguerite, took subtle delight in spreading insinuations that Eleanor's marriage was one of pity rather than preference, that the Duke's choice reflected duty, not desire. At dinner, Eleanor overheard fragments of conversation, veiled laughter, and thinly disguised pity. "The Duke, delicate as he is, chooses such a spirited bride, how curious," a lady remarked, her tone light yet edged with condescension. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with indignation, though she maintained the graceful composure expected of her. Every insult, every subtle slight, strengthened her resolve. She would not allow her dignity to be eroded by the idle chatter of those whose lives were devoted to appearances rather than truth. As the days unfolded, Eleanor observed the Duke with a more discerning eye. There were moments, brief and fleeting, where his reserve faltered, a soft sigh, a glance that lingered too long, a hand pressed against the carved wood of a balustrade as if seeking support not merely for his body but for his thoughts. She began to sense the loneliness beneath his composed exterior, the layers of sorrow and caution that had shaped him. Her heart stirred at the realization that this man, whom society had labeled frail and broken, carried within him a depth of feeling and a capacity for tenderness that no gossip could diminish. Their interactions remained formally constrained, yet charged with subtle energy. In the library, while Eleanor examined a volume of poetry, the Duke approached, standing silently behind her chair. "You have an eye for verse," he observed, his voice almost a whisper. She looked up, startled, and met his gaze. "It offers solace in times of unrest," she replied carefully, choosing her words as one might select gems from a casket. He inclined his head, a faint smile ghosting his lips, and for a moment, the world outside, the judgment, the scandal, the expectation, fell away. In that fleeting exchange, a thread of connection was woven, delicate yet unbreakable, hinting at the intimacy that might flourish between them despite the constraints imposed by society. Preparations for the wedding itself brought with them both tension and revelation. Eleanor's days were filled with visits from dressmakers, jewelers, and florists, each offering opinions and expertise that she met with a quiet patience. Yet even amidst the meticulous arrangements, moments of scandal surfaced. A servant let slip rumors of the Duke's former engagement, long broken under mysterious circumstances. A letter intercepted hinted at financial strains within the estate. A distant cousin commented upon the fragility of Eleanor's health, as if to imply she might not withstand the demands of married life. Each disclosure was a small tempest, threatening to shake her resolve, but Eleanor faced them with measured calm. She began to understand that the path she was to walk would require not only courage, but discernment, patience, and a willingness to see beyond surface appearances. One evening, as twilight draped the estate in a cloak of muted lavender and silver, the Duke approached Eleanor in the conservatory, the scent of jasmine and damp earth heavy in the air. He held the locket once more in his hand. "I wish to share with you a truth," he said, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "This token is not merely a relic of my family's past. It carries my hope that you will see, beyond the expectations of society, the man I am, and perhaps, the man I might become with you." Eleanor's fingers closed over the delicate chain, and she felt a pulse of warmth in her heart, a recognition that beneath the exterior of duty and fragility lay a depth of feeling that could not be ignored. The evening waned, and the house settled into a hush, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of curtains or the distant toll of a carriage bell. Eleanor retreated to her chambers, locket clasped tightly in her hand, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had seen, in fragments and fleeting gestures, the complexity of the man she was to marry, and she had glimpsed the possibilities that lay beyond the confines of social expectation. The journey ahead promised challenges, whispers, and trials, yet also offered the glimmer of understanding, respect, and perhaps, if courage and fate aligned, the first stirrings of a profound, shared affection. As she laid her head upon her pillow, Eleanor understood that the days leading to her wedding would test her resilience, her patience, and her capacity to read the unspoken language of a man who had learned to guard his heart. And yet, in that quiet moment, she allowed herself a fragile hope that within the walls of Ashbourne House, amidst the whispers and the weight of society's gaze, a union might emerge that was not merely one of duty, but of quiet understanding, delicate trust, and a love yet to be fully revealed. The storm outside had passed, leaving the night air crisp and still, a harbinger of the transformations, revelations, and unspoken promises yet to come. The evening of the wedding arrived with a quiet solemnity that seemed almost to hush the entire estate. Outside, the last traces of autumn mist curled around the bare limbs of elms and maples, the air crisp and fragrant with the scent of damp earth. Within Ashbourne House, the corridors glimmered with polished brass sconces, their flames reflecting off the richly adorned walls. Lady Eleanor moved with careful composure, her silk gown brushing the floor, her heart a delicate flutter of fear, anticipation, and a fragile hope she scarcely permitted herself to acknowledge. The grand hall, prepared for the ceremony, seemed simultaneously welcoming and forbidding. Every echo of footsteps, every rustle of silk, felt amplified, as though the walls themselves were witnesses to her private trepidations. The Duke of Ashbourne, standing at the head of the hall, bore the weight of expectation with a quiet dignity that both intimidated and fascinated Eleanor. His posture was upright, yet there was a subtle stiffness in his movements, a reminder of the whispers that had trailed him through London society, that he was a man weakened by ill health, shadowed by past heartbreaks, and perhaps even resigned to solitude. Yet as Eleanor approached, she discerned something more nuanced in his expression, a depth of thought, a gentle awareness, and a keen observation of her every gesture. When their eyes met, it was not merely formality that passed between them but a spark of recognition, as if each had glimpsed the unspoken truth of the other's soul. The ceremony itself was brief, dignified, and devoid of unnecessary flourish, attended by only the closest family and a handful of discreet witnesses. Vows were exchanged with careful precision, each word steeped in the conventions of propriety yet weighted with personal significance. Eleanor noted, with a flutter of surprise, that the Duke's voice, though low and measured, carried a warmth that belied the rigid exterior society had so often described. "I pledge to honor and respect you," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "In this union, I see not merely duty, but a partnership that may yet flourish, should we choose to nurture it together." The phrasing was subtle, almost veiled, yet it conveyed a promise that resonated deeply within Eleanor's heart, stirring emotion she had long suppressed beneath layers of caution and expectation. After the ceremony, the house settled into a hushed anticipation, the servants discreetly withdrawing as Eleanor and the Duke retired to the private chambers that would mark the first moments of their life together. The room was adorned with muted elegance, velvet drapes framed the windows, a soft fire flickered in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across polished floors, and a delicate arrangement of roses filled the air with their subtle fragrance. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the folds of her gown, her mind racing with a mixture of nerves and wonder. She had anticipated a cold, distant partner, yet in the silence of the chamber, she sensed the presence of a man both guarded and vulnerable, a man whose heart, like her own, had been tempered by trials and expectation. The Duke moved closer, his steps deliberate, measured, yet imbued with an attentiveness that Eleanor could not ignore. He extended a hand, not merely in courtesy, but as an invitation to trust, to bridge the gap between duty and something more intimate, more human. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of unspoken emotion, "I have not spoken freely of my life, nor of the burdens that accompany it. But I wish, in this moment, to share a truth that has long been confined to solitude." Eleanor's breath caught at his words, a mixture of curiosity and cautious anticipation stirring within her. She inclined her head, silently encouraging him to continue, aware that these first moments could define the tenor of all that followed. He spoke then, with a sincerity that pierced the careful veneers both had been taught to uphold. He recounted the illnesses that had shadowed his youth, the losses that had carved hollows in his heart, and the quiet isolation that had shaped his existence. Yet within the confession lay not despair, but a deliberate choice and acknowledgement that, despite society's expectations and the whispers that sought to define them, he had observed Eleanor from afar and recognized in her a strength, a courage, and a kindness that could not be ignored. "I did not choose you because I am commanded to do so," he confessed, his gray eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight and the intensity of his feeling. "I chose you because your spirit shines where mine has dimmed, because in your presence I perceive a partnership that transcends obligation, a connection that promises both challenge and solace." Eleanor's hands, previously clenched lightly at her sides, rose to touch the locket he had given her days prior, the delicate gold filigree warm beneath her fingers. Its significance, now illuminated by his words, carried a weight she had not fully understood. It was not merely a family relic, but a symbol of trust, of hope, and of the depth of feeling he had begun to place in her hands. Her chest swelled with a mixture of surprise and emotion, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel that the union she had feared might be cold and obligatory could, in truth, contain the seeds of something profound, tender, and enduring. Their dialogue, measured yet intimate, wove a tapestry of understanding, each phrase carrying layers of meaning that neither could fully articulate but both sensed. Eleanor found her voice, trembling yet steady, as she spoke of her own fears and hopes, her sense of duty tempered by a dawning recognition that perhaps she could find in this marriage not merely obligation, but companionship, respect, and even affection. "Your words," she said softly, "carry a truth I had scarcely dared to hope for. In the silence of expectation, I had imagined only distance, yet here I feel a possibility that I had not foreseen." The Duke inclined his head, a faint smile brushing his lips, and reached for her hand with a gentleness that belied the strength of his conviction. Outside, the storm had softened into a gentle rain, each drop pattering against the window like a quiet applause for the fragile intimacy that had unfolded within the chamber. The firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating not merely physical features but the dawning realization that they were, in this moment, not simply bride and groom, but two individuals beginning to perceive the potential for shared understanding and mutual respect. The locket, resting between them, became a tangible symbol of the promise of trust and the courage required to embrace it. As the night deepened and the quiet settled over Ashbourne House, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest measure of hope. The path ahead would not be without challenges, the whispers of society, the expectations of family, and the lingering shadows of past sorrow, but for the first time, she perceived the possibility that love, carefully nurtured, might bloom within even the most constrained of circumstances. And in the hush of that private chamber, where firelight and whispered words intertwined, a bond had begun to form, delicate yet resolute, a union that promised both challenge and solace, mystery and revelation, a story yet to be fully written in the days and nights to come. Morning light poured gently through the tall windows of Ashbourne House, glancing upon polished floors and delicate curtains that swayed with the faintest whisper of a breeze. Lady Eleanor stirred in her chamber, the locket warm against her palm, a reminder of the Duke's words from the night before. The air was crisp with the scent of dew and faintly of roses that still lingered from the previous evening's arrangements. In the quiet, she felt a new sense of clarity. The shadows of fear and obligation that had once loomed so heavily now seemed softened by understanding, by the awareness that the man she had been compelled to marry possessed a depth of feeling and integrity that she had scarcely dared to imagine. The Duke of Ashbourne entered the chamber, his steps measured, deliberate, yet carrying a subtle energy that bespoke both anticipation and affection. His grey eyes met Eleanor's, and for the first time in days, there was no restraint, no mask of cold propriety, only sincerity, a raw honesty that made her heart quicken. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice resonant and warm, "I have spent much of my life constrained by expectation and the shadows of misfortune, yet last night, in the quiet of this room, I have glimpsed a possibility that I had long thought beyond my reach." He paused, drawing closer, the firelight glinting softly upon his coat buttons, illuminating the careful lines of his face. "I am yours to know, should you wish it. Not by command, not by custom, but by the choice of my heart." Eleanor's hands trembled as she clasped the locket, a tangible emblem of trust and shared understanding. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice threaded with both awe and cautious hope, "I feared that I would enter this union as one constrained by duty alone, yet your words illuminate a path I had scarcely imagined. Perhaps there is room for affection, even in the strictures of society." Her eyes searched his, and in the silent intensity that passed between them, she sensed a bond that had been forged not merely of circumstance, but of recognition and tentative trust. Together, they walked to the terrace, where the morning sun cast golden ribbons across the manicured gardens, dew glinting upon the rose petals as though nature itself applauded their quiet understanding. Eleanor felt the weight of expectation lift slightly, replaced by a fragile, exhilarating freedom. The Duke extended his hand, a gesture both formal and intimate, and she accepted it, feeling the warmth of his fingers entwine with hers. Their movements were deliberate, echoing the careful choreography that society demanded, yet beneath the veneer of propriety lay a growing sense of shared purpose and connection. "The world outside will judge us," the Duke said softly, his gaze sweeping the horizon, "but it cannot dictate what passes between us in honesty and intention. I have observed you in moments of courage, in small gestures unnoticed by others, and I am compelled to declare what I had long concealed. My heart, it belongs to you. Eleanor's chest swelled with emotion, the careful training of years striving to contain her joy, yet failing as a delicate tear traced her cheek. She reached for his hand, pressing it against her own in a gesture of mutual surrender and trust. And mine to you, she replied, the words firm, sincere, and filled with the quiet exhilaration of revelation. They lingered on the terrace, speaking of hopes, of fears, and of the future that now seemed neither dictated by duty nor diminished by society's whispers. Each phrase, each glance, carried the weight of unspoken understanding, the recognition that they were now partners not merely in name, but in spirit. The locket, resting against Eleanor's chest, gleamed in the morning light, a symbol of both trust and the delicate promise of love. In that quiet communion, the world beyond the estate walls, its gossip, judgment, and rigid expectation, faded to insignificance, leaving only the possibility of mutual care, respect, and affection. By mid-morning, the first of their family and close confidants had arrived, bearing congratulations and subtle scrutiny. Yet Eleanor and the Duke moved through the reception with newfound composure, their interactions now suffused with a natural intimacy that had been absent before. Observers noted the subtle, respectful attentiveness in the Duke's posture, the ease with which Eleanor responded to his gentle guidance, and whispered among themselves that perhaps this marriage, once thought a matter of necessity, held the promise of genuine partnership. Every smile shared, every brief touch of hand or brush of elbow, spoke volumes that formal language could never convey. Later, in the privacy of the drawing room, the Duke presented Eleanor with a small journal, its cover worn with careful use. For your thoughts, he said, his voice softened with a tenderness rarely afforded in public discourse. To record what you feel, what you hope, what you dream. I wish to understand you fully, and perhaps, in time, to share my own reflections with you as openly. Eleanor accepted the gift with a warmth that was both gratitude and affection, sensing in the gesture a deep respect for her mind and spirit. This small act, seemingly mundane, reinforced the emerging truth that their marriage could flourish not only through duty but through understanding and shared intimacy. As the day progressed, Eleanor and the Duke wandered through the gardens, the morning's gold giving way to the soft glow of afternoon. Each step, each shared observation, each quiet laugh, wove the fragile threads of intimacy more firmly between them. Where once there had been fear, awkwardness, and the heavy weight of expectation, now there bloomed curiosity, respect, and the tender stirrings of love. Society might whisper, the tongue might speculate, but within the confines of Ashbourne House, a narrative of mutual regard and emotional awakening had begun to take hold. By evening, the household settled into a peaceful routine, the soft crackle of firelight filling the chambers with warmth. Eleanor paused by the window, looking out upon the quiet gardens, and felt the locket against her heart. She thought of the journey that had begun with whispers, judgment, and reluctant acceptance, and now, at its first turning toward genuine connection, she allowed herself a moment of unguarded hope. The Duke, observing from across the room, offered a gentle nod, an acknowledgement of the bond they were nurturing, fragile, yet resilient, delicate, yet profoundly real. The night drew to a close with quiet understanding. The Duke took Eleanor's hand, pressing it lightly against his chest, and spoke softly, "Let the world speak as it will, Lady Eleanor. Here, within these walls, and within our hearts, we may write our own story, guided not by expectation, but by what we know to be true." Eleanor's lips curved in a gentle smile, the first in many weeks that was free of hesitation or fear. She pressed her forehead to his, a private gesture of intimacy and trust, and whispered, "Then let us begin, together." Outside, the moonlight bathed the estate in silver, and the gentle rustle of autumn leaves carried a quiet promise that love, once unexpected and tentative, might grow with patience, courage, and mutual understanding. In that final hush, Ashbourne House seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the culmination of fear, anticipation, and restrained emotion transformed into the first glimmers of authentic connection. Society's scrutiny might continue, whispers would persist, and trials of various kinds would surely come, but Eleanor and the Duke had discovered, in one shared night and the tender hours following, that their union need not be merely a matter of duty. Within the flicker of firelight, the quiet of dawn, and the intimate exchange of hearts and words, they had glimpsed the possibility of a love grounded in respect, understanding, and the patient nurturing of fragile hope. And as the night deepened, they faced the future together, their hearts aligned, prepared to navigate the delicate dance between society's gaze and the quiet truths of their shared life.